Polynesia is a distant and isolated part of the world, geographically the most distant, separated from all other landmasses. A little known fact is that the concepts and methods of fighting that originated from there were very unique, and due to the overall culture in the region, were brutal in their nature. In ancient times, the peoples of the South Pacific often had relations with one another in terms of kingdoms and even empires. Not all of these interactions were peaceful. Often there were cases of violence, and one tribe or island would conquer another tribe or island in said circumstances. If your island or islands were properly defended, then you could keep your life and independence. If your defenders were not skilled, then there were every chance you would die and your people or homelands would be enslaved by a neighboring island. In modern times, an ancient burial mound was discovered in the Tongan Islands in 1964. These burial mounds had the remains of a large amount of people within. Certain genetic DNA markers can be noted with people as such factors for increased risk of certain diseases or traits that can be inherited from one generation to the next. During these said tests, scientists were looking at the bones of individuals from the mound and noticed a particularly odd circumstance that repeated itself and was actually quite startling. Fingers and horn bones of these people were broken and the joints healed back differently. This was particularly odd, as this was not exactly noticed in other regions of the South Pacific. In the case of Tonga, when the Europeans first contacted the native peoples, they recounted stories that in ancient times they were extraordinarily skilled in terms of boxing. There have been recorded accounts that in the 1770s, when Captain James Cook and his third expedition sailed through that region while mapping and exploring that particular area of the South Pacific region, an excerpt from his diary mentioned, quote, "If unoccupied, Tongans entertain themselves with boxing and wrestling, women sometimes as well as men, boys, and girls. The Tongans staged boxing and wrestling matches, inviting sailors into the ring and promptly defeated them, except when they let the sailors win for diplomatic reasons." Owing again to the research done in the mid-1960s, an artist on the said voyage actually produced sketches of fights that they had witnessed upon journeying to the island of Ha'apai, and features two pairs of men in combat, one pair using wooden weapons, and another with their fists wrapped in a length of cord. Modern researchers have theorized that this might have been a wrap to protect the hands, something like a predecessor to modern hand wraps used in boxing and mixed martial arts fights. Recollections of the fight mention that at least 3,000 people were watching the fight and were present. Testimony for a fighting style and most impressive strikes were to, quote, "turn round on their heel just as they have struck their antagonist and gave them another very smart one with the other hand backwards." Women fought with just as much tenacity and ferocity as men. Even children such as boys and girls would quote-unquote box very bitterly for short periods of time for matches. Boxers who lost a said match were observed to sit down with neutrality after a match, and were viewed as if they had never fought a match at all in terms of their facial or bodily expressions. A few of Captain Cook's sailors who decided to engage in a boxing match with the Tongans were, in the words of a quoted observer, worsted. There have been accounts of Samoans being versed within boxing as well, but there is no evidence that it was on the same level of brutality that the Tongans once regularly performed. More records describe the style of wrestling on Tonga called pi'itauva'a, or alternately called pangatua, which would now be considered a standing free style of wrestling. A said wrestler could grasp any part of the opponent's body, but would mostly attempt to grab onto an opponent by the waist. A wrestling match begins with a contestant trying to conveniently hold each other. Wrestlers held one another by the waist and try to raise an opponent and attempt to throw them onto the ground by their back. Being defeated, a loser stood up and accepted the defeat. Being injured, wrestlers just smiled and let others assist them. In modern times, within American professional wrestling organizations, wrestlers of full or partial Samoan descent have been known to be very skilled in the art of grappling and throwing. It's owed to the Samoan styles and attitude towards wrestling. In modern times, Samoans have been viewed as stocky and large in terms of body size, but in ancient times they used the shape of their bodies to their advantage, in terms of using their weight in body size or mass as a weapon against others. As a result of this, Samoans used their strength and wit to outsmart, outmaneuver, or even outweigh their opponents in a match or contest or event. When Tonga and Samoa had contact with European explorers, settlers, and missionaries, the once proud Tongan and Samoan fighting cultures sharply and quickly declined, and ultimately disappeared. Missionaries in particular did not approve of the brutal fighting styles that had once been so important to the Tongans and Samoans for vast generations. Records later show that upon being converted to Christianity, the Tongans and Samoans either abandoned the fighting arts that they had honed and developed through war and conflict, or created quote-unquote less brutal styles of fighting in an attempt to incorporate the aspects of foreign religion imposed by the colonials. It became so severe that the stories of Tongan and Samoan warriors became that of legend and myth, not exactly considered true, when in previous centuries they were considered fact and considered truth. What is worse is that there is little to no proof about the techniques or methods used to train the body, hone the mind, and adapt the soul to the life of ancient fighting. All that is left are records from early contact with the British and stories left behind by the Tongans and Samoans themselves, to try and keep at least some aspect of their ancient fighting cultures intact, so future generations could remember their former greatness.